Good morning, everyone. Alma Jenkins Acosta worked with UNICEF for more than 20 years at the Regional Office for Latin America and the Caribbean and in the Panama office. She has served as Program Emergency Response Coordinator as well as UNICEF's Migrant Response Coordinator for the Venezuela outflow in Trinidad and Tobago from 2020 to 2024. In the Eastern Caribbean, she contributed to recovery efforts in Antigua and Barbuda following Hurricanes Irma and Maria. She is currently the education specialist for the Norwegian Refugee Council, NRC, supporting operations in Colombia, where she lives, Ecuador, and Panama, her native country. Alma holds an MSc in Public Service Administration from DePaul University in Chicago, Illinois, USA, and she is currently a doctoral candidate at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. On a personal note, in 2021, the UE St. Augustine held a workshop for primary school teachers in collaboration with the Catholic Education Board of Management, CEBM, sponsored by UNICEF, and I met Alma at that time. Her work on capacity building and psychosocial support for protecting children and migrants in humanitarian settings has always been of interest and fascinated me. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Alma Jenkins Acosta.
Good morning, everybody. It's good to be home. I consider Trinidad and Tobago my second home. And somebody actually texted me this morning and said, how does it feel to be back home? And it does feel very good. So thank you to the Center for Language Learning for having me. So I do want to start this presentation with a little bit of humor, because I do think that humor also expresses a lot and is a segue to communication, even when we cannot find the words. I wanted to find the video that I am going to share with subtitles, but unfortunately it hasn't been subtitled. So I hope that this goes well, that technology is cooperating with us this morning. Those of you that are Spanish speakers will get it, but I also want to test how much those of you that don't speak Spanish can get out of it. So here we go.
Ante todos los presentes, en nombre de mis señores, los reyes, Isabel de Castilla y Fernando de Aragón, tomo posesión de estas tierras, que a partir de ahora serán conocidas como San Salvador, por orden y gracia de...
Buenos días, papeles.
¿Perdón?
Los papeles. Permiso de entrada al país, visado, permiso de trabajo, lo que sea.
Pero yo no tengo más papeles que el mandato de mis señores, los reyes de Castilla.
Ya. ¿En la patera cuántos vienen?
¿Patera? Carabela. Y a bordo hay más de 120 hombres hambrientos y también enfermos. ¡Bajad de la barca!
¡Quedaos en la patera! El que no tenga papeles ya se puede ir dando la vuelta.
Perdón, caballero. Mi tripulación y yo llevamos 2 meses de penosa travesía en la mar Oceana. Yo soy Cristóbal Colón. ¡Bajad de la barca!
¡A la patera todo el mundo! Ya se le ve que es usted Colón, que se quiere colar. Pero si no tienen papeles ni han pedido asilo político, son ustedes ilegales y se acabó.
Miren, señores, debe haber una confusión. Yo estoy aquí para hacer historia. ¡Bajen de la barca!
¡A la patera todo el mundo! Menos historia y menos historias. A ver, ¿de dónde venís?
De los reinos de Castilla y Aragón.
Encima tienen distintas nacionalidades. Si a estos va a ser difícil devolverlos en caliente.
Yo vengo en misión especial para descubrir y conquistar estas tierras.
¿A conquistar? Está claro que no pensáis integraros en nuestras costumbres ni tradiciones.
¿Pero qué costumbres y tradiciones?
Para empezar me vais a rellenar todos estas tablillas. Solicitud de entrada en el país, motivo del viaje y calendario de las vacunas por orden. Y de aquí nos vamos todos al centro de internamiento, donde se os dará una manta y un bocadillo.
¿Y tú para qué dices nada del bocadillo?
Lo de la manta, ¿cómo no van a acabar de manteros si les damos la manta ya de entrada?
So I think this video, apart from being funny, I think captures and gives us a lot of stuff to unpack. First of all, because there is this uneven relationship, there's a power relationship there, which I want to put right in the center of this discussion about migration, because it's about power at the end of the day, right? It's about who can and cannot cross a border, and then we call people who cross borders different things, right? We call them illegals when persons are, you know, as many. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I actually thought of my paternal grandfather, who was born in Jamaica, took, of course, last name Jenkins from his enslavers. But this is kind of the second migration of, you know, my ancestry, if I think about my ancestry originating actually in Africa. So I want us to all be aware also of our ancestry as we are transitioning this discussion this morning. And I have organized my presentation trying to talk first of all about dynamics of interactions. You saw that we started this video with an interaction, and again it was about power and about power dynamics. But we see in nature other dynamics of interaction, and I'm going to talk a little bit and try to drive that home to Trinidad and Tobago. We're going to talk a little bit about adaptive management, how our countries adapting to manage mixed flows. Trinidad and Tobago has had basically on a large scale the Venezuela outflow, but there are people in Trinidad and Tobago from other nationalities that we need to consider as well as we think about this more broadly. We need to talk about social cohesion, and I think this yesterday afternoon, I think we had we got our feet wet a little bit with some of our discussions around language, and but also about meaning. So I think there's a lot to do in terms of social cohesion, protection recommendations, and then some public policy recommendations. So I also want to say that when we are talking migration, I want to put this definition out there, that we refer to multi-directional because people go in many different directions, multi-directional movement of people and their thoughts. See, people don't go only themselves, but they bring their humor, they bring what they know, they bring their food, they bring their different ways of knowing. So they bring their thoughts, their relationship, and materiality in large groups or smaller units, or as individuals over long distances or within a region and across various time scales. See, the Venezuela outflow, for example, that has been the most recent, is not the only outflow that Trinidad and Tobago has had. There has been many different influxes into the country and by various different groups as well. So we keep this notion of also time scales with us. I think the region as a whole has experienced the migration of 7 million Venezuelans, almost 8, and they are also creating their own diaspora touching many countries. I hear that some people here are from Brazil. I am now working in Colombia, where there's 2 million Venezuelans. And migration is a specific form of mobility that occurs when people move to settle into another destination. So this is going to be the definition that I am proposing. So, of course, I had to bring in Trinidad and Tobago references. And some time ago, when I was visiting the red ibis, I went at a time, my first time I did get to see the birds, but the second time, you know, I kind of lost track that birds actually migrate. But then I learned another fact, and that is that the red ibis, and correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but apparently starts the morning off in Venezuela and actually makes a transit into Trinidad and Tobago. So I think there's a lot that we can learn also from nature, and I think Trinidad has some very, very valuable lessons. So for birds, the most frequently proposed mechanism is that birds migrate to benefit from seasonal availability of resources. And of course, this drives a lot. We've all heard the pull and push factors of migration. But I think people are reconfiguring, and if you think about this session is a lot about that mobility. And this explanation has been put forward to explain observed positive correlations between where birds go and at what time. And it's not only birds, but if you think about it, some of the things that are happening, and I just want to quote two that are happening very fast at very different, and are showing up in very different environments than they're used to. One is whales are showing up, and even I remember in Trinidad about 2 years ago there was a sighting. And when we thought about whales, we always thought of them in the Pacific, never in the Caribbean or Atlantic Ocean, right? So it is this availability of resources, because some habitats are shifting and changing, which is driving different patterns. And this is also what is happening with migration. There was a time, for example, when Venezuelans were, well, actually, let me start by saying there was a time when Colombians were going into Venezuela, right? And about 10 years ago, that started to shift. And now Venezuelans are not necessarily going into Colombia or into Trinidad as they used to, but they're going to other places. Does anybody know which country is the preferred country for migration of Venezuelans these days? No? Not Ecuador? Actually, think across the pond. It's Spain. And you know why it's Spain? It's actually Spain because Spain has a lot of Spaniards living in Venezuela, and people have just gone back, and some of them claim citizenship, right? So it's again this dynamic, and so we cannot think about the phenomenon as a steady one that settles, right? The second one is crocodiles that are also appearing at places, at beaches that they never used to appear, and this is because something has been disrupted. So the disruption causes a dynamic that we all need to be aware of. So my second reference in Trinidad, there's a third one, is leatherback turtles. Anybody knows what leatherbacks do and why they come to Trinidad? they go to a lengthy migration and come and nest in Trinidad because that's where they were born. Or all turtles go back to the beach where they were born, right? So it's a beautiful thing to witness, but I think, again, a reference to nature to try to capture that migration is only but natural. It's a natural phenomenon. So I want, providing these references, I want to kind of demystify that all of a sudden we're having migration. No, we've had migration ever since, right? So this dynamic of interconnections, we need to recognize that it's influenced by many things: economic, social, because you have linkages to the people or the language. For people going now from Venezuela going now into Spain, for example, it's easier because there is a common language, so it's not a barrier as you would have it with Portuguese or with English. And at the end of the day, many of them are claiming back relationships that they had, familiar relationships and other types of relationships that they have. Political, for example, because in the case of Colombia, the former President Iván Duque opened the country to Venezuelans and provided special permits, special stay permits, in the case of Colombia, in solidarity to the population. And, you know, these dynamics, of course, are not linear. So the second thing is that migration policies then, this is where we break away, right? Because when you think about policies, you always are thinking linearly and not about these discontinuities that happen when people start to move. So I want to start asking questions and leaving questions behind, because one of them would be, how do we manage, for example, in terms of education, to keep a system that is always able, is resilient enough to always allow for children to fulfill their right to education, which is, you know, kind of cornerstone question. So adaptive management, how do we ensure that the policies are flexible and adaptive? And do we have good examples of policies that are shifting when, if and when they see changes in migration patterns, allowing for real-time responses? Because even when we think about what has been happening and the trajectories, we see that things have changed a lot. And those of you that have been invested in, for example, the response here in Trinidad and Tobago are fully aware how much things have changed and are changing as a result of the latest policy decisions that have been taken by the government. What we have seen is that then there is a drop, there is a decrease, people start to leave, people start looking for the next place to go that perhaps presents some of those better resources, so that they can go. So how do we ensure that the policies carry with them some flexibilities? Do we know of any good examples that are adaptive and that allow for those real-time responses in economic shifts, in climate events, in political stability? And let me just say that this year has been a good example of this, because in January, when the policy of the US government shifted, or even a little bit before, because the Biden administration had already taken some policy decisions, it all started to shift. And people were a little bit just expectant of what the latest policy was going to be for them to make the changes. I also want to say that this adaptive management should not be mistaken for just a haphazard shift in the policies, right? Because the difference is that haphazard policy making is not following any data or any evidence. It is actually driven by other dynamics, most of them political, right? I think we all need to be aware that there is, in many cases, and there will be in other instances, climate events that are going to continue to drive migration, and other cases of political instability. So, for example, for those closer to Ecuador, Ecuador is having a violence phenomena that is driving a lot of internal movements, but also was driving a lot of upward movement that is now stagnant and needs to find other places to go. Of course, we also need to be mindful that these are opportunities for organized crime, and organized crime is driving the situation in Venezuela. And I'm saying that because of the Tren de Aragua, but there are other cartels that are also linked to these dynamics. So I want to highlight here that this adaptive management is concurrent. So there's a dimension when you're managing migration, and there's one where you are also trying to mitigate the impact of organized crime. So here is to speak to the issue of social cohesion, and I kind of change around the graphics because of how much the conversation yesterday afternoon sat with me in terms of social cohesion and how we build a model for social cohesion, thinking that, and here's where I want to put a question, thinking that we have a whole generation of children that have been out of school for the last 7 years, that are experiencing othering relationships, and that of course get every so often the opportunity to be linked to an educational program, but not enough to be able to read and write at the level that they should. So this trajectory for education, that is one of the cornerstones to social integration and to be able to dialogue in society, is interrupted. And it's not only interrupted, we cannot think of it steady just in Trinidad and Tobago, but we have to think about that trajectory and its interruption wherever it goes next. So whether it goes to Brazil or whether it goes to Ecuador, these trajectories continue to be interrupted. And of course, there are policies that those countries are taking to try to close the gap for those children. So for example, both Colombia and Ecuador have accelerated education programs. I haven't caught up with what Spain is doing these days in terms of providing the children with education, but in addition to accelerated learning, they're trying to recuperate learning as fast as they can through bridge programs that also enable children and adolescents to continue their trajectories. But it's not only child trajectories that are being broken, it's also the trajectories of and the disruption of professional careers. I am sure that many of you have met people who were lawyers and are now janitors, who were doctors and are now teachers, who were engineers and are now security people in the front of a shop, right? So there's a lot of disruptions as people try to find the next thing to do. And what I want to put forward, taking from yesterday's discussion, and I'm sorry for those that were not here, but that allows you to catch up really quick with yesterday's discussion, is that when we look at it from a conflict-sensitive perspective, then we need to be mindful that we need to cater to the needs of all people in order to be able to make those bridges and actually talk about social cohesion. Trinidad and Tobago, as it is, and there's a good study that was done by UNDP last year that expressed how Trinbagonians felt about social cohesion and what are the challenges that internally the country has. Now, I'm sure that you, being in the territory, understand that people do not trust the government, and that is not singular to Trinidad and Tobago. So imagine if migrants are going to trust the government. But so that's that vertical line, but there's also the horizontal line about, do I trust my neighbor? Do I trust the people that live in close proximity? Or are these the people that are going to call and have me arrested? And so the level of distrust that the country has in and of itself then becomes the resting place of the anxieties and the mistrust of those that are coming in. So this is being exacerbated, and I think it's one of the things that needs to be most urgently addressed. And one of the ways to address it is actually supporting children getting education, because this is where you start building trust between peers in the classroom, learning together. So I do think it's something to be very mindful of. Again, this is my third reference from Trinidad and Tobago. There is in Trinidad the main Reach Forest Reserve. Does anybody know why I may have possibly included this reference from 1776? It's the oldest protected area, even before Yellowstone Park. So Trinidad has been an example of what protection means. So this is my segue into protection. So if the country wants to do protection, the country can do protection because it has done before for something that it considered it was fundamental, like the main Rich Forest Reserve. So I want to talk about protection and what that could look like in terms of, and I want to put it in three dimensions: a multi-layer protection framework that we need to have. And for example, that multi-layer protection should look at children having access to education and to health, parents having access to work, and having access to, whether they are a refugee, they are seeking for refugee status, or are asylum seekers, or just temporary migrants, they should be, those rights should be protected. So when you have that multi-layered protection framework, you really have a stronger footing in terms of what that means for the population, and actually enables the population to settle in a more steady way, which is what is needed. So the second thing I want to say about that is one of the ways to get to a multi-layer protection framework is to collaborate to multiple stakeholders. Yesterday there was a question about what to do with parents. I think, Tracy, you asked that question about what do we do with parents, right? So I do think that Trinidad has done, in terms of the number of organizations that got involved, the number of religious groups, I think the country did well in terms of providing that safety net when the government wouldn't. The question is, how do we sustain it? And currently, the discussion in the humanitarian world is about localization, right? And there's very, very strong discussions about, one, if no humanitarian organization can step into whatever crisis, can the people in those communities take the lead in terms of responding? And I do think that, for example, we saw cases of that, very strong cases of that, done here in Trinidad and Tobago. The question is, can we scale them up? Can we write about what we learn? Because the second discussion, I would argue, after the rug got pulled from our feet with the changes in policy from the US government, is, should we be learning more about what we did and how we responded to all of these crises linked to the different migrations? Because I am talking about Venezuela because it is the one that has touched Trinidad and Tobago the most. But at some point we thought that we were going to get many more Haitians, and Haiti is not done, right? We have yet to see what will happen in Jamaica, and this is of course climate driven, right? But this is just to see that we have the phenomena breathing very close to our ears, right? So localization and learning are very important for what our current discussions are. How do we establish capacity to make sure that first respondents are community members? Second point is about strengthening social networks, which I think fits and ties very closely to this, which is support the development of social networks among migrants, which can support each other, but also with the communities that are hosting them, and facilitate community connections that integrate migrants into local society. So protection goes hand in hand with social cohesion. If we do not protect the population, it's going to be very hard, because there's going to be that mistrust that hinders horizontal relations and also vertical relations. The third one is mental health and well-being services. And again, I do think that there are some capacities that should sit with communities. The reason for that is because the World Organization publishes every 2 years a study about the capacities in the mental health sector, and they're not enough. And I was having a conversation last night with somebody that was saying, even when mental health is now a regular conversation after the COVID pandemic, we don't necessarily get the specialized profiles and competencies that we should be looking and having to make sure that people get the care and the treatment that they need. And if you have seen the pyramid for mental health and psychosocial support, what we need is the basis. And that means a lot of people within the community can provide that care and that psychosocial support, right? That is not specialized care. Specialized care goes up in the ladder, but in terms of that initial psychosocial support, that can be provided within host communities. So provide accessible mental health services tailored for migrants to address trauma and ensure their emotional well-being. And integrate mental health. A good way to do this is, of course, integrating mental health into primary care. A challenge in the case specifically of Trinidad and Tobago is that people did not get access to primary care. And this is why education and health services that are fundamental for people to access other rights. And then public policies recommendations, and then I think I have already been talking to you 33 minutes. So I promise that I will keep it short. So in terms of public policies, there is, I think, as I was saying before, the need to be learning more about what we have been doing over the last 10 years and how we have built resilience into our systems, made better policies, because many of the countries in the region had to do a major overhaul of their migration policies. We were not there. The region was not there. The region was not ready to provide such a scale of support. And there were good examples of what countries coming together could do, because also migration is not necessarily a one country effort. It is an effort that requires a concerted effort by many countries at the time. So encourage cross-border cooperation between countries to address shared migration challenges. And again, of course, this has to do with education because it's close to my heart. When you look at education policies, for example, making sure that children can use the certifications that they have from previous studies and carry them into the next country, and that those be accepted. And I think the region, in terms of the Convenio Andrés Bello, has a good example of what that can look like. It's not without challenges, it's not a perfect system, but it enables children to be placed at the right level and continue their trajectories. And another one is to harmonize policies across regions to ensure coordinated response to migration, included in the context of climate change. A few months ago in Colombia, I was sitting in a meeting where the country was specifically having a session dedicated to what were the challenges that they were finding in terms of accreditation of diplomas coming from Venezuela into Colombia or from other countries. And some of those challenges are political, because there are institutions that will not respond and validate the titles of people who studied originally in Venezuela and have decided to move on. But some other challenges also persist that I think need to be considered. And educational and skills development initiatives, I think these are fundamental. A lot of the people and those of you who have been working on this issue for the last 10 years or so know that the challenge with the outflow has been that the people who left Venezuela are for the most part young people, which means they were either in the process of building their trajectory in terms of professional trajectory, or they had an initial degree and needed to continue, because many of us also know that Venezuelans like to continue their trajectory. So the challenge is then how to make sure that they can fulfill those trajectories. But also, I think we should not lose sight of the bigger question, which is what is going to happen in Venezuela when things shift, when things change, and there's no young people in the country. And that then becomes the next country people are going to migrate into, huh? Because this is exactly what happened, for example, in my own country. When you have changes that are so dramatic, for example, political changes that are dramatic, like Panama faced in 1989, it had a US invasion, then the country grew from there. But the country could not grow if you don't have a population. So these are some of the challenges, and again, I am putting the dynamics, which is where I started, that those of us that are frustrated about why does it keep shifting, well, it's because it's the nature of the beast, you know, in many ways, that things are bound to change. And if I can wrap up with 2 points, it would be to make sure that we have policies that we can substantiate based on data, and that keep the pulse in terms of what is happening and what is needed, and that those policies are fit for purpose. And the second is on social cohesion, making sure that where people go, where they are integrated, for example, as part of this effort of localization, there's always a safety net that will at least provide those horizontal connections, and that in some ways drives, I want to say, because yesterday this also stuck with me, drive the demand for state parties like Trinidad and Tobago to comply with the rights of children, but also of all migrant people. And those rights are multi-layered and need those protections. And it sits with us.
Good morning. I'm Kai Lehmann from the University of Sao Paulo. I will have to read you my presentation for this afternoon. You took half my stuff in terms of what should be done, but that's fine. I do wonder, though, you said some of the things that you think should be done, and I totally agree with you. In my presentation, I will compare it a bit to Europe, where the EU is also grappling with that, and but does something completely different to what actually should be done. So how do we get from the what should be done to actually getting it done on the current political circumstances? I mean, Brazil is quite different in that respect, because they quite agree on Venezuela, despite the polarization and what to do with them. But in Europe, you know, the things that should be done are politically somewhere between very, very difficult to impossible at the moment. So that's my question.
No, thank you very much for the question. I don't know if there's any other, or I should go with your question. I think we're living very complicated geopolitical times, and it's all transactional right now. It's quid pro quo. You know, what is it going to get me? And, you know, then I get you what you need. Still, it's very interesting to know that there are a few organizations that continue to be right-based, and I would say partnering with those that will not kind of settle because they want to make a living as opposed to make the right thing. And I think it's partnering with those that want to make the right thing and that will call, you know, what needs to be called off, right? So, and there's a few. It's a good thing that there's a few. It's not all of them. There's not a whole lot of them. But this is where I think, just as the geopolitical map is shifting, I think we need to shift our partnerships as well. and start talking to people that we did not talk or engage before, right? Because that's the only thing that is going to move the agenda forward. I think that if we look at what's happening, and I didn't want it to divert because a part of me wanted to go into the AI thing and what is going on in the artificial intelligence space. But I think that we need to look and assess what is happening elsewhere to understand also what is happening within the humanitarian space and what is happening in terms of migrant issues.
Thank you for that very engaging presentation. Yesterday, you kept referring to yesterday, so I feel I can do the same. Someone made a very interesting comment about how well communities have done, as you've said, to take up the slack where political and state organizations have not. But they also said that communities cannot create policies, communities cannot raise, the living standard of people who, of vulnerable groups. So that's always going to be a disadvantage. What are your thoughts on that, and where do you see communities being able to make great improvements to the lives of people without sometimes the aids of governments?
Well, I have to go a little bit into the example that Trinidad has set, and I think it was talked about yesterday. If I think about the Presbyterian community and what they did enabling migrant children going into their space in Naparima, right? I think that sets, of course, more can happen. And I'm not going to idealize what has happened, but I think more of that and with intention can shift things around. So this is the example that the Presbyterians have presented. I think the Catholic Education Board of Management and the Catholic community have also presented an example because they went further and they said, and we will take the first step and take the children in. And this forces in so many ways the government to also shift. So I do think it's exactly the type of step that moves the needle forward. It's not at the speed, I think it was Camila who was saying yesterday, it's not at the speed at which you want to see it happen, because of course, for us as adults here in this room, to think about what we were doing last year at this time is one thing. For a child that has not gone to school, to think what they have done the last year is a completely different story, right? The sense of loss is unfathomable, right? But I think taking that step forward for the Catholic education and the Catholics as a community and the Presbyterians as a community, because let's take a step back. If none of these communities was there to say, we'll take the children in, there's absolutely nothing, right? So I do think, even if it looks very small, there was a presentation I delivered some time ago about using the tipping point metaphor, that you think that nothing is happening, but you reach a point where you put enough pressure on the exact point that the pressure needs to go, that crumbles everything else. And I think this is exactly what we have, the possibility that we have with the children entering school. Because if you allow me 2 more minutes, I would say that the Trinidad and Tobago education system deals with its own issues, right? Bringing the children, migrant children, into the classroom is the thing that I would say has to make us revisit everything again, right? So it's kind of that tipping point effect.